Good day, class. All right, this is History and Systems of Psychology, Psych 400. I'm your instructor, Dr. Anthony Hubert. We've already covered the syllabus and an overview of Canvas. Now let's look at an overview of this course by way of the textbook, what we'll be covering throughout this semester. We'll be looking at what is science. In the first few chapters, we'll focus on this thing we call science and give you hopefully a better idea of actually what it is and how it progresses and develops over time, and historically how it did sort of evolve. Then we look at what is the mind, or the philosophical historical roots of thinking about the mind. And then we'll end up in the last part of the textbook looking at what is psychology. This will be after the field and discipline of academic science of psychology has been developed. Now, one of the things that I want you to think about is how this course sort of is laid out, particularly from the perspective of the textbook. So basically, we see this. Somebody comes up with an idea and they propose this idea or concept or philosophy. So they say this thing here, and this is the way this thing operates. But then someone else will show up and respond to what that person said. So, in essence, what we see here is, what did X say? This original guy posts this information, so to speak, and then someone else responds to it. What did Y say in response to X? We'll see that carried throughout most of this textbook. That we'll see someone make a proposition about something, and then someone's going to respond to it. So today, in this lecture, what we'll be covering is what it is that means to study history, studying history itself. What is science, and then examining psychology as a science. We'll start off with definition of psychology, writing about history of psychology and why it is that we study this, looking at what science is, its underpinnings, and also examining whether or not psychology is a science, or more precisely, why psychology is a science. First, the definition of psychology. It has evolved and continues to evolve in some extent. So there's no really one single definition from a historical perspective. It has changed. Historically, it was defined as the study of the psyche or mind or spirit, the study of consciousness or behavior. And at one point or another, we've seen this be the cornerstone of the definition of psychology. And of course, times change, we evolve, new schools come into favor. For example, behaviorism. Hardcore behaviorists will only say it's all about the behavior, not this idea of consciousness or thinking and things of that nature. So the definition of psychology does change, and it may change still. But the idea is that it is somewhat of an evolving thing. Today, we're very comfortable for the most part with the definition we have of psychology, the study of the mind and behavior. So, there are a few problems that we have when we are writing about history of psychology, or any history for that example. But one of the first questions we ask is, where do we start in this idea of history of psychology? We could go all the way back to ancient man's explanations as to why people do this. Why do they behave that way? What's going on around us? And their explanations sometimes would fall under the umbrella of superstition. The early Greek philosophers, they had theories of cognitive processes. They were at least asking the right types of questions. And again, we talk about philosophy a lot in this course because philosophy is one of the roots to what psychology is. It's one of the parents of psychology, this thing we call philosophy, where they ask these very poignant and very deeply rooted types of questions about human nature and what it means to be human, for example. And when psychology became a separate science, it wasn't until the 19th century, not that long ago. 1879 is sort of dedicated as the year that psychology became a separate academic discipline. So, Other things that we want to talk about when it comes to the problems in writing about history of psychology, not just about where to start, but what to include. We have presentism, an attempt to understand the past in terms of our present knowledge and standards. Now, this presentism can be a little bit tricky at times because we're looking back, let's say, at a historical figure that lived hundreds of years ago. But in looking back at this historical figure that lived hundreds of years ago, and we maintain our present knowledge and our present standards, for example, our morality and our ethics as being 21st century people, we may start to get a little judgy about that historical figure because we're using the standards of life and our morality today to judge a person from a few hundred years ago. Presentism may have its place, but the idea is that we need to be aware of that possibility. We live in different times than someone who lived 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. We also have historicism. So here, the what to include is this: a study of the past without addressing the relationship between the past and present. So here we study history without trying to see it through the eyes of present times. We study history for the sake of history alone. So without addressing the relationship between the past and the present, we just study history. The amount of detail and presentation of the evolution of concepts and ideas would also be an idea that we need to figure out what it is that we're actually going to include in writing about history or history of psychology. Another problem is the choice of approach. How are you going to approach this history? The spirit of the times, the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist is an approach that emphasizes the influence of developments in other sciences, the political climate, technological advancements, economic conditions, and so on and so forth, and the development of psychology. Psychology does not exist in a vacuum. It is not isolated. When we have psychologists that are coming up with their research programs, coming up with their approaches to therapy, what have you, they will be influenced by what is around them, by the politics of the day, about other sciences, other endeavors, other fields. You can't avoid it. For example, when I started psychology years and years ago, and we'd be reading the general psychology textbook, they would have examples of technology that would be used as an analogy to describe some sort of human function like memory or getting information from the outside world into your brain. There were terms such as the great switchboard, if you even know what that is, a telephone switchboard, that you get information from the outside, it says it's visual information, and then it plugs it into the right outlet so that it can be sent to the occipital lobe, for example, to be processed. Then I saw it go from the switchboard to the router station. And we can look at memory as an example too. Memory has this information processing model that uses the keyboard to input data. Okay, we can see it on the monitor, and then you store it to the hard drive and retrieve that from long-term memory into our working or short-term memory. So the spirit of the times lends itself to lots of things in psychology, describing, using analogies of scientific technology to describe certain human functions. So that's the spirit of the times. Another approach is the great person approach that emphasizes the works of individuals. So here the focus is on a person and this person and the type of work that they did. So we are looking at this history from the perspective of what this one individual did, like a Freud or Skinner or Watson. We see it from their perspective. We look at their works. Now, another choice of approach is the historical development. This illustrates how individuals and or events contributed to changes and development of ideas and concepts. So we can see one idea that's spawned by an individual, and then we can see how others have added to that idea, how others have or discoveries have added to that idea, and it sort of evolves and changes over time. And then finally, we have the eclectic approach, which combines these three approaches in whatever way the writer wants to present it as they write about the history of psychology. So it would look at not only the historical development approach, it would also look at the other approaches like the great person or the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, in order to weave together its story of the history of psychology. So then the question becomes, why is it that we study the history of psychology? First, it comes down to this: getting a deeper understanding allows for greater awareness of where psychology's subject matter came from and why it is considered important. So, as we go through this course, we'll be looking at some of the philosophical roots and foundations of psychology. We'll see where they came from. We'll see why a long time ago it was a question. They didn't know what the answer was or what they should be doing, and so philosophers debated this, and then we came to sort of a decision and sort of a, took into ourselves a certain perspective of thinking. So we'll see that and hopefully get this deeper understanding as to where all this stuff comes from that we've talked about in a variety of other classes in psychology. Another reason why we study the history of psychology is the recognition of fads and fashions in psychology. The ability to recognize that a current avenue of research or body of knowledge may be affected by subjective and arbitrary factors of society. We'll see this play out a little bit later in chapter 2 when it comes to Thomas Kuhn. But the idea here is this: we need to understand that psychology and the evolution of psychological ideas is not always going to be a rational one. So here we're saying, as we go through history, we learn what has gone on before, we have the ability to recognize that a current avenue of research or body of knowledge may be influenced by other factors, personality, subjective factors, and arbitrary factors in our society. Again, as I stated before, psychology does not operate in a vacuum. We're connected to so many things, and psychologists are people too, and they will be influenced by them. One of the other reasons, obviously, is trying to avoid repeating mistakes of the past. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. A somewhat famous quotation. The idea is we understand what has gone before, what people have been challenged to do and to understand. And by knowing this information, where we've been, we have a better understanding of where we need to go and what types of things we may need to avoid under similar circumstances that in the past may have caused a whole heap of problems for previous researchers, thinkers, or psychologists. So being familiar with the history of psychology helps to avoid repeating the mistakes of previous researchers and practitioners. In addition to that, studying the history of psychology can be a source of valuable ideas. Individuals can become familiar with earlier ideas that may have remained dormant for a variety of reasons. So it becomes a way to look into our past to see the ideas that may have sprouted up but never took to seed, never bore fruit. And the idea here is that these ideas could be examined now. So you have a source of new ideas, new possible researches that you can perform. So that is some of the important items that we're going to talk about when it comes to history. Why it is that we study history. how it is that we do this study of history. What are the problems of approach? What are the problems of what it is to include? And where and when are we going to start in the study of history of psychology? Now we talk about science. What is science? Some, such as Galileo and Kant, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, have argued that psychology could never be a science because of its interest in subjective experience or mental events. And of course, the behaviorists tried to address this during its heyday in America by trying to go away from mental events altogether. Those hardcore behaviorists says no, it's only about those objective things that we can measure, that we can quantify. So obviously, some of the great thinkers in the past had similar ideas about what science is, and some issues that psychology would have to overcome in a way if it was truly going to be seen as a science. So, what is this science? Well, science can be thought of as developed as a way to answer questions about nature by directly examining nature, in contrast to unquestionable acceptance of things like church dogma, past authorities, or superstitious ideas, or by just sitting and thinking and having abstract thoughts alone. So we look at science, and normally we think of it this way. We have this empirical observation, direct observation of nature. So that's a key thing, and we see this played out quite a bit in the first chapter of this textbook that focuses somewhat not only on Popper but on the empiricists. Science has two major components: this empirical observation and theory. So define science: a combination of rationalism, think of logic and rationale, and empiricism, using our senses to observe things around us. Rationalism is the mental operations or principles, rules of logic that must be employed to attain true knowledge. Empiricism, the source of all knowledge, is sensory observation. Scientific theories are formulated. Scientific, scientific theories have two main functions: organize empirical observations, provides guidance for future observations. Also, this idea of confirmable propositions. Theories suggest propositions that are tested experimentally, and if they are confirmed, then the theory gains strength. Otherwise, the theory will be revised or abandoned. And of course, you guys are saying, yeah, 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 you remember all of this. This is stuff that you've heard for many of your classes, and you probably first heard it a long time ago when you took journal psychology, when they went through the basics of psychology in that first chapter. So, looking at science again and defining what it actually is, well, science, they want to search for laws. The search for laws. A law is consistently observed relationships between two or more classes of empirical events which is amenable to public observation and verification. Law. Consistently observed relationship between two or more classes of empirical events which is amenable to public observation and verification. Other people can see it, and they can see it quantified, and you can get confirmation that, yeah, I see it, yeah, I see it too. So these things can become laws. Two classes of scientific laws: correlational laws, how classes of events vary together; causal laws, how events are causally related. So a major goal of science is to discover the cause of natural phenomena. So again, we're sort of breaking down what this idea of what science actually is. Another aspect, which is a very important aspect of science, is this: the assumption of determinism. What is being studied can be understood in terms of causal laws. The idea is very simple, that we see some sort of behavior, there's a cause as to why that behavior happened. And because we assume this determinism, that means we can find it out. We can find out what that cause is. And then if we know what that cause is, we can apply that to other very similar situations and say, yes, I've seen this before. It's usually caused by this determinism. So we assume this determinism exists when we talk about science. So to wrap up this little segment here, the idea is, what are the traditional views of science? Well, we have empirical observations. We must observe something. There must be something that we can use our senses for to collect data about the world and the phenomena of the world around us. Theory formulation, testing, and revision. We have some sort of theory, some sort of explained relationship between the phenomena that we are observing. And then we have some way that we can test out this relationship. The theory, if it holds true, we should be able to make prediction as to what's going to happen given certain situations. Then can figure out a way to test it. If the testing is good, meaning that it sort of supports our theory, it came out the way we intended it to, that's great, we have support. But if not, we may need to revise something. For example, revise our theory a little bit. Also, part of the traditional view of science is this ability to predict and control. If we have this theory, we come up with a educated guess, a hypothesis, to say, given the situation, we predict this is going to happen. And of course, if we're doing testing, we have to control the testing environment so that, for example, only thing that we want there is the thing that we're interested in manipulating to see what the result is on the dependent variable, for example. Traditional view of science also includes the search for lawful relationships. And again, it always assumes that these things are determined. The assumption of determinism, meaning that we have the ability to track down the cause of something. We'll stop there for now.